Hello, my name is Ezenwa Ungbenu, and this is
Wow.
And in this episode of Know Your Foods, we're going to be looking at seasoning cubes. Paul, waiting with this thing we hold for him.
I'm happy.
And you dey put them for food, abi?
Yes, put that for soup.
And you go get taste.
Yes, you get this.
Okay.
After you don't charge, you get your body self.
Your body go dey good.
Yes.
So this thing is good for the body.
Yes.
Well, in this talk, we're going to be looking at the negative health effects of seasoning cubes. And contrary to what my research assistant is saying, seasoning cubes are definitely not good for your body. So a seasoning cube is basically a condensed soup base. So this could also be called a broth cube or a bouillon cube. Paul, you can call this bouillon.
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 Billion kilo.
Billion.
Yeah.
So it's a condensed soup base, and they come in various flavors: chicken, beef, fish. But what actually brings the flavor is the chemical monosodium glutamate. Monosodium glutamate is basically a single sodium and the amino acid glutamic acid. So it's a salt of glutamic acid, and when we consume MSG, it disassociates into the sodium and the glutamic acid. Now, how does MSG actually enhance flavor? Well, MSG enhances flavor because it interacts with glutamate receptors on our tongue. So the tongue basically perceives 5 senses, roughly, which we refer to as sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and savoriness. And glutamate provides this savoriness. It's also referred to as umami, and that savoriness is what gives a kind of heartiness or richness to meals. It gives the sensation of having meat in that meal. Now, glutamate also serves other functions in the body, and MSG enhances flavor because of the abnormally high concentration of glutamate. Recall, glutamate is an amino acid, so it's a constituent of proteins. So we have glutamate all over the body, and we get it from a lot of foods. There are a lot of foods that are rich in glutamic acid, such as milk, egg, seafood, wheat, corn, soybeans. They are all rich in glutamic acid, but these seasoning cubes have an extraordinarily high concentration of glutamic acid, and that's what makes them such potent flavor enhancers. Because literally, you could cook a very poor meal, but once you just add one of these cubes to it, everything becomes okay. Such as like what my good friend Paul said, you know, it just makes the meal well-rounded, well-balanced, and very tasty. Now, but that abnormally high concentration of glutamate is a big problem, because it does not only interact with your tongue, it is absorbed, and all that glutamate enters into the body, and it's the systemic effects that are the problem. And the basic negative health effect of MSG is how it interacts with nerve cells. That is, it's an excitotoxin. It is neurotoxic. So let's just look at a nerve. So let's just say if this was a network of nerves. So this is the body of the nerve, and this is the nerve fiber. And these nerves all communicate by sending electrical impulses with each other. Now, glutamate in the body also serves as a neurotransmitter. That is, it is used in the body for the communication of information between nerve cells. Now, when we take MSG, there is an abnormal amount of this neurotransmitter that is introduced into the body, and the nerves become overly excited, and that is why MSG is an excitotoxin, because it excites these nerve cells, because glutamate in the body is a excitatory neurotransmitter. It causes nerve cells to send or to fire electrical impulses more often. Now, the abnormal concentration of glutamate in seasoning cubes causes nerves throughout the body to fire abnormally, excessively, and some of these nerves die or become damaged. And that is the primary negative health effect of MSG, that excitotoxicity. It excites nerve cells to the point of death. Now, glutamate is such a potent flavor enhancer that it is in so many processed foods, aside from just seasoning cubes. And because there is a growing awareness of the negative health effects of glutamate, it's now couched in so many different names that one would not know which food contains glutamate or not. But to put it simply, glutamate is such a potent flavor enhancer that if you poured it even on like roadkill, that roadkill will become palatable. That is just how powerful this thing is. And it works so well for the processed food industry because essentially most processed foods are very low quality ingredients that they just bring together, and then they have to enhance it chemically for it to be palatable. So glutamate is a cornerstone of the processed food industry. And if it wasn't for MSG, many processed foods would not be commercially viable because we would be able to perceive how low quality those ingredients are, because a low quality ingredient tastes like crap. But because of MSG, so you find MSG in canned soup, you find it in many pastries, you find it in many microwave meals, you find it in many snack foods. It's almost in everything. Now, let's briefly look at some of the synonyms that MSG is also called under. So Paul, what I want you to do for me is that each name I mention, after which you go say in a background. Okay. So MSG is also called glutamic acid, hydrolyzed protein, autolyzed protein, textured protein, yeast extract, soy sauce, protein isolate, modified food starch, broth, calcium caseinate, seasoning, natural flavors, gelatin, maltodextrin. Now, if you look at many processed foods that advertise no MSG because they are aware of the growing awareness of the negative health effects, but they still sneak in MSG, but they call it something else. Now that is just the commercial logic of this processed food industry, because they recognize without processed food that without glutamate, many processed foods would simply not be sellable. Now look at some of the names. Natural flavors. How would anybody ever know that natural flavors is a reference to MSG? But in many cases it is. Or seasoning. How would anybody know that's a reference to MSG? Or gelatin or maltodextrin. And that is just the pernicious logic of this profit maximizing principle that you see in a lot of these processed foods. Now let's look closely at the implications of this excitotoxicity. Now, MSG kills or damages nerve cells, and nerves are distributed throughout the body. But to simplify this discussion, we'll only look at the effect it has on a particular region of the brain. So, if this is your head, this is your brain, within the brain there is a structure called the hypothalamus. And we're going to examine MSG in the context of its effect on the hypothalamus. And the effect basically is that MSG causes lesions in the hypothalamus. That is, it causes regions of dead nerve cells. It damages the hypothalamus. It does not allow the hypothalamus to function normally. So what are the health implications of a damaged hypothalamus that results from regularly consuming foods seasoned with seasoning cubes and other processed foods that contain MSG? Well, when you have hypothalamic lesions, one important thing that happens is that the communication between fat cells in the body and the brain is broken. And that communication is mediated by a hormone called leptin. Fat cells communicate to the brain satiation, and leptin is very important for appetite regulation. When you consume MSG, for example, seasoning cubes, that damages your hypothalamus can no more register what the fat cells are communicating to the brain, and then you have uncontrolled appetite, and then you eat uncontrollably. And also, leptin is also involved in energy consumption in the body. So when your hypothalamus is damaged, the body thinks that it is starving because it's no longer getting the satiety signal communicated by leptin. So you eat more, and then your body also shuts down its metabolism. So it's a double-edged sword. And one effect of this is runaway weight gain. And runaway weight gain leads to overweight, and in severe cases, obesity. So MSG plays a critical role in the obesity epidemic, because a lot of people who are overweight or obese desire to lose weight, but there is an uncontrollable impulse. It's because the problem is in the biochemistry, and part of the problem is the biochemical implications of consuming foods or seasonings that contain MSG, because of the brain damage that it induces. So that is one effect. Seasoning cubes promote rapid weight gain, and they also promote obesity. Another effect of a damaged hypothalamus is that it disrupts communications between the pancreas and the brain. And in this instance, we're talking about insulin, because the hypothalamus is critical for regulating insulin throughout the body. Now, when the hypothalamus is not able to register what insulin is communicating, then you develop insulin resistance. And another term for insulin resistance is the metabolic syndrome. Now, I will not go into too many details of the mechanisms of this, but this is the implication. When you consume seasoning cubes regularly and other processed foods that contain MSG, the hypothalamic lesions result in insulin resistance, also the metabolic syndrome. Now, the metabolic syndrome is at the heart of most chronic diseases, because insulin dysregulation, because insulin controls so many processes in the body, and when insulin is not regulated properly, too many things go wrong in the body. So, seasoning cubes are a major contributor to the metabolic syndrome. And the metabolic syndrome is a reference to a collection of numerous chronic diseases. So, for example, hypertension, that is chronically elevated blood pressure. High blood cholesterol, that is when the liver produces abnormal amounts of cholesterol because it's no longer being regulated by insulin, because insulin also regulates cholesterol production in the liver. So it leads to high blood cholesterol. It also leads to heart disease, because this excess cholesterol is deposited in coronary arteries, and that occlusion or the blockage of blood supplied to the heart also leads to heart disease. It also leads to type 2 diabetes, because when your body is no longer able to respond to what insulin is communicating, it leads to chronically elevated blood sugar, which is basically type 2 diabetes. It also leads to polycystic ovarian disease, which is when the ovaries develop lesions within them, because when there is a disruption with insulin, it has implications downstream, even in the reproductive organs. So, notice, seasoning cubes damage the hypothalamus, which disrupts many other processes in the body. So, a lot of the chronic disease epidemic can be traced back to a lot of these chemicals that are in modern foods. For example, in this environment here in Nigeria, many people cannot eat a meal without seasoning cubes. And unfortunately, many restaurants, many places that produce food commercially, they must also use seasoning cubes because the average person, his taste buds is accustomed to the abnormal amounts of glutamic acid that you get in these seasoning cubes. And the implication of that is that you have chronic disease everywhere. And when you observe, when you look at the health statistics, you find that chronic disease is rampant and is almost everywhere. And this is part of what contributes to that. It's not the full story. Many other things are also involved, but this is a major contributor. Now, I want to briefly talk about wider endocrine disruption. That is, let's go back to the hypothalamus. So, the hypothalamus is a critical structure in the body for regulating many hormonal systems. And you know, hormones are a means of communication between distant organs in the body. Now, the hypothalamus is the master controller. So when you talk about hormones in the body, everything really begins and ends with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus initiates hormonal communication and also terminates a lot of hormonal processes. So if we look at the female anatomy, now we know that downstream are the reproductive organs. So this is the uterus, and these are the ovaries. And the hormonal system that is involved with the hypothalamus and then these reproductive organs is the menstrual cycle. Now, when we consume foods that contain abnormal amounts of glutamic acid that damages the hypothalamus, it also disrupts the reproductive cycle because the hypothalamus is involved with the regulation of the menstrual cycle. It's known as the hypothalamo-pituitary gonadal axis. So it's an information superhighway that goes from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, which is another structure in the brain, which now also releases hormones that affect the ovaries, which also has effects downstream on the uterus. So when we consume a lot of foods that contain glutamic acid, there is a disruption. And that could lead to many things. One thing that it could lead to is fibroids, when you have abnormal growths in the uterine wall. It can also lead to lack of ovulation, known as anovulation, because all these processes require clear communication between the ovaries, the uterus, the hypothalamus, and the pituitary. And these processed foods and seasoning cubes in particular disrupts this communication system. So aside from fibroids and lack of ovulation, it basically just reduces fertility generally, because fertility is when there is smooth communication between these various structures, when there is harmonious communication in the body. But seasoning cubes do not allow for that. And I'll just stop here because there are many other ways, because the hypothalamus sits on top of so many other hormonal systems that also involve, like the adrenal glands, that involve the thyroid, but it just creates hormonal havoc in the body, just to put it simply. So Paul, what thing I thought we say, this seasoning cube where everybody they use, this thing no they good.
Why now?
Why? The reason we say the thing they damage something inside body.
People you don't like I go chop and well.
People they chop and well
yes,
again. Waiting man go do, but people don't know. But now you don't know.
I know now.
You don't know now,
yes.
You go still chop and
you go manage it now.
you go chop
because you go chop. No go after you don't put for soup. Soup no go get taste.
no go get taste.
Yes,
So you must stay there.
Okay. And that was even the canteen say
Canteen.
or BP canteen go use am.
Then they use an natural all the restaurant.
Yes,
so they use an natural.
because no go use am. People can talk say no put Maggi.
No put Maggi. I understand. I understand. So there you have it. The choice is yours. It's advisable to minimize consumption of foods seasoned with these seasoning cubes, and also a lot of processed foods in which many of these are, in which MSG is couched under many other synonyms. So it's useful to really shift away from processed foods to more whole foods and protect yourself from the negative health effects of monosodium glutamate. Thank you so much for your time.